We begin with something of a misnomer. So little of this novel takes place in Northanger Abbey that we could well wonder whether the book earns its title. On the other hand, we could say that the shadow of the Abbey falls over the events of the entire novel. A work in which Austen is concerned with the intersection of Gothic imaginings with reality. To that end, there are three main aspects to our approach to Northanger Abbey. The first is to explore the Gothic presences in the book, how Austen is drawing on Radcliffe and the craze for Gothic fiction. Secondly, we're going to consider something quite opposite, how Northanger Abbey could be considered a realist work, which portrays the manners of people in Austen's time. And thirdly, we're going to look at how these two aspects, the realistic and the fanciful, combine to form social commentary. Northanger Abbey is a parody of the Gothic novel, by which I mean that the conventions of Gothic fiction are adopted for the purposes of humour, plot devices, character types, physical settings, and the gloomy motifs of Gothic fiction are employed for the purposes of comedy. Usually comic because to us they are so obviously misplaced amid the events and characters of the novel. Frequently, the humour is derived from incongruity. The well-meaning friend Mrs. Allen, for example, is imagined as a potential jailer. The notion that the gentle Mr. Morland might lock up his daughters is raised and dismissed. The narrative assumes a tone of affectionate mockery, both towards the main character, Catherine Morland, who imagines herself the heroine of a Gothic adventure, and towards Gothic fiction more generally. The context for Austen writing Northanger Abbey is that the Gothic had become a cliched literary genre. Radcliffe had enjoyed immense success in the 1790s, begetting an enormous amount of imitative fiction, often low-quality hack work, as we might say, appearing in magazines. There was, for a time, a seemingly inexhaustible appetite for the genre, even for these less accomplished executions of Gothic fiction. There was a publishing industry that was keen to cater for the taste as long as it remained profitable. But not everybody was happy about this. That the same characters, motifs, settings, and plot devices were used over and over became a subject of mockery and exasperation among critics. A critical essay from 1797 refers to the trends in Gothic fiction as a so-called terrorist novel writing. The author complains, "It has been the fashion to make terror the order of the day by confining the heroes and heroines in old gloomy castles full of spectres, apparitions, and dead men's bones. This is now so common that a novelist blushes to bring about a marriage by ordinary means, but conducts the happy pair through long and dangerous galleries where the light burns blue, the thunder rattles, and the great window at the end presents the hideous visage of a murdered man uttering piercing groans and developing shocking mysteries." Austen echoes this critique when Henry Tilney and Catherine Morland drive towards Northanger Abbey for the first time in the book. Tilney teases Catherine by speculating on the gruesome adventures that await her in the Abbey. The clichés of Gothic fiction are so well established that Tilney can guess Catherine's unspoken imaginings about the place. Tilney effectively constructs his own Gothic adventure from the materials that were endlessly reused in popular fiction. To provoke Catherine, Tilney alludes to mysterious manuscripts, locked cabinets, violent storms, gloomy passages, peculiar circumstances in lonely bedchambers, and sinister-looking daggers. Later, when Catherine is alone in her chamber, Tilney's words come back to her and cause her imagination to run wild. At this point, she reenacts a scene from Radcliffe's Romance of the Forest, parodically, in a crescendo of suspense as she investigates a strange cabinet and some locked drawers. Catherine discovers a mysterious manuscript which turns out to be an inventory of the household linen collection, and not, as in Radcliffe's novel, a personal account of torment and murder. Austen is playing on readers' awareness that these ideas have become fatigued. These ideas may be getting worn out, but there's also a much more serious matter at stake as the essay on terrorist novel writing continues. A novel, if at all useful, ought to be a representation of human life and manners, with a view to direct conduct in the most important duties of life and correct its follies. But what instruction is to be reaped from the distorted ideas of lunatics, I am at a loss to conceive. Tradition held that literature should inform the reader, not simply entertain, but provide morality and useful factual information. Here the critic expects the novel to instruct its readers, not simply to deliver fanciful stories. Lacking this kind of content, the critic is asking implicitly, what is useful in Gothic fiction? In Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen asks the same questions with humorous intentions. In Northanger Abbey, Austen takes on these ideas to explore how the conventional reader of Gothic fiction is equipped, based on that reading, to encounter the real world. And this stereotypical reader is Catherine Morland, a teenage girl who has never previously been away from her family. She is inexperienced in love, she is middle class, unlikely to face poverty, but also unlikely to marry above her station. Catherine is an example of the limited education available to women at the time, and she's an emotion junkie who is addicted to the thrills of Gothic fiction in compensation for the sheer boredom of her own existence. Catherine expects the people she meets to behave like stock characters in Gothic novels, and she attempts to employ her reading as a sort of practical knowledge to interpret the world around her. Through a series of comic misunderstandings, Catherine comes to believe that General Morland has murdered his wife. And this is the exaggerated culmination of Austen's investigation of what might happen if Gothic fiction was relied upon as a source of instruction for someone whose life was too restricted to gain experience of the real world. Naturally, Catherine's process of deduction here relies on perceived resemblances between the general's behaviour and accounts of his wife's death with murders in literary works. Catherine wonders how the general's conscience could allow him, a supposed murderer, to show himself in church, and privately she compares him to criminals she has read about. Catherine is using literature as a substitute for experience. Time and again, Catherine is shown to be deluded, and the characters never behave the way she expects them to based on her reading. Mrs. Allen, for example, comes across as the talkative spinster figure we encounter in Radcliffe novels, but amazingly she's found someone who's willing to marry her. Henry Tilney is slotted into the place of love interest, but he doesn't behave in the manner we'd expect him to from a book. He is, for example, not quite handsome. He displays an unusual knowledge of fabric. He's not the character Catherine expects, and this confuses her. Yet, importantly, our judgment of Catherine is not exclusively negative, despite these misunderstandings. True, she's often disappointed or baffled because she is naive, but equally at fault, and this is very significant, is the disingenuousness, the dishonesty, and the hypocrisy of the characters around her.